going to take you through today, we called it PreActive Cyber Hygiene, the MITRE ATT&CK Dirty Dozen TTPs. So what we're going to go through today, we wanted to go through and give you a short introduction about who we are at AttackIQ. It'll give you some context of how we got to some of the information that I'm going to give you in terms of TTPs that we've seen fail the most. After that, I'll present to you what we're calling the Dirty Dozen, basically from our cloud TTPs and from our cloud customers, we've observed the most failed scenarios across our customer base. So these are tactics and techniques that are not being mitigated correctly. So it's a good place for you when you go back, get an understanding of maybe how your environment is managing those type of threats, and maybe something to raise while you're out there on the floor to vendors and ask them how they mitigate those specific tactics and techniques. And then we'll go through and tie those, what we call scenarios at AttackIQ, which I'll explain, back to MITRE technique IDs, the tactics involved, the data sources that you as an organization can use to identify that activity. And then I'll show you kind of a little bit of a heat map association to threat actors. So in this case, and then we'll finish off by John speaking about how he's gone about and implemented some controls around some of these things in his program. So to start things off before I actually kick off, I want to introduce myself. My name is Jose Barajas. I'm the technical director at AttackIQ. So I have a research and background. I used to work at WebSense. Now I'm here at AttackIQ for the last about 3 to 4 years. And I'm now focused on developing this new emerging market breach and attack simulation through AttackIQ. And then I'll let John introduce himself as well.
Yep, John Fung. Wow, that's loud. I'm currently at UTC, where I'm Associate Director of Cybersecurity and Risk Management. Over there, I lead the content development and threat hunting team. Prior to that, I stood up their Security Operations Center here in the United States and in Ireland. Prior to that, mostly in financials.
Cool. All right, so let me walk you through some of the things that I've done, starting by explaining kind of what we do, just to give you some context of how I arrived at the kind of 12 TTPs that I was talking about. So we are here as an output of our product. AttackIQ is a breach and attack simulation platform. Our objective is to measure the effectiveness of your security controls. The way that we do that is by recreating attacks within your environment in order to measure your ability to prevent or detect that activity. And what I specifically want to kind of help you understand is what do I mean by prevention from the perspective of our product, because again, that's what's going to feed into how I kind of got to those 12 TTPs. So to start, this is a result where the activity was not blocked within our product. As you can see here specifically, we actually were able to successfully steal some credentials, and we actually even show the logs highlighting exactly what we've done. So from our perspective, this was not prevented. The objective of this scenario or this objective of this tactic is to actually obtain credentials from the local system. And clearly, we were able to successfully do that. So the controls that should have been in place to mitigate this, interrupt our process, didn't actually occur as expected. We clearly obtained those 2 credentials. So to us, that's when I say not blocked or not prevented, that's what I'm looking for. Which techniques were actually most pervasively not prevented by our customers? In this case, the objective is stealing credentials. Other tactics have other objectives. For example, bypassing UAC is modifying the UAC levels, as an example. So if the scenario is able to obtain the objective, like in this case, credential theft, that's what we consider not blocked. And just very briefly, I wanted to show you what the alternative of that is. In this case, we can see failed to execute Mimikatz. The technology I have in place here, the moment that we try to execute this binary, it actually kills our process. So we weren't able to execute. Obviously, we didn't retrieve any credentials as part of this process. And then we actually take it a step further through our integrations and actually validate that your security controls appropriately recorded the activity as well. We're not going to get into that here. What's important, as you can see here, there's a log where it got, execution got prevented. What's important is what I'm going to present you next. The 12 TTPs that we're going to focus on were basically the ones that were most not prevented, not blocked by our customer base in the last 6 months, based on our cloud telemetry. So these are actually the 12 tactics and techniques, or the 12 scenarios. We call them scenarios in our product. A scenario can be made up of more than one MITRE technique. Some attacks may require multiple things to happen. The example I just showed you, for example, first we have to make what's called a volume shadow copy, and then we steal credentials from the volume shadow copy. that's taking, that is actually 2 tactics from the perspective of MITRE. So just wanted to highlight that. So these are the naming conventions that we have within our product, but they tie back to very well-known TTPs. The first one being, run DLL through run DLL 32. That ties back to the DLL 32 tactic within MITRE. And what I wanted to highlight here with this graph is really just the distribution amongst the most kind of, not blocked. We can see that the first few are a little bit more pervasive than the other ones, but overall, it's kind of clearly distributed throughout our customers. So let's go ahead and jump into this a little bit further. So now, what I then took is our scenarios, and I wanted to map those back to the MITRE technique IDs. Out of those 12 scenarios, those were actually composed out of 16 unique MITRE technique IDs that you see here on the left. So this is basically what I'm considering what those dirty dozen scenarios are made up of. These are the tactics and techniques that our customers need to focus on in terms of mitigating. And as an organization, we'll be working with them kind of in these kind of next 6 months, kind of collectively through our Customer Advisory Council Board, talk about strategies. I have quite a few customers that have different strategies for these tactics, so we want to be the means to share some of that. And then to the right, what I wanted to show you here as well is the distribution across the different tactics themselves, so the columns in the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, and see where they're kind of spread out as well. Now, this is actually a view where we're highlighting the different tactics across the MITRE ATT&CK matrix itself. Organizations that are starting to map things are kind of see how familiar, are a little bit more familiar with this. And what I just really want to highlight is where are the areas where we saw more tactics that were actually not being mitigated. And in this case, we can see a lot of that is mostly in the execution phase, and then also distributed across persistence, defense evasion, and credential access. Credential access being one of the ones that, in my kind of experience here, is where I've observed the most misconfigurations, just kind of anecdotally working with our customers. We're seeing a lot of credential theft. We actually have a Windows credential theft assessment. I always claim it as my favorite assessment because when we go to a new customer, that's immediately where we're going to find some protection failures. And most of the time, it's simply you turning on one feature in your product from off to on, rerunning the attack with our product, and now we can confirm that it's appropriately blocking that tactic or technique. So just wanted to highlight that credential access one. That's the one I personally see not being mitigated correctly, even though our customers clearly have the right technology in place to mitigate those type of tactics. So something that you guys should look at in your environments. The next thing that I want to look at now that I have these MITRE technique IDs, I wanted to look at from the perspective of MITRE, what are the data sources that you as an organization can use in order to identify this activity? So what I found is out of the 16 tactics, I think the one we have here, process monitoring, covers 12 out of those 16 MITRE TTPs. So what that means to me here is basically, if you're just logging basic, process monitoring syslog and use it as a basis to create rules, you can have a pretty effective coverage of some of these, tactics that most of our customers are not preventing today. And it's actually kind of another thing that I'm noticing amongst our customers is them starting to ingest syslogs, Windows event logs, Windows API logs, and really writing rule sets around that. I think it's a pattern that I'm observing with just the overall how pervasive MITRE has become. Tons and tons of GitHub repositories, happy to share those afterwards with you if you want, that are just sharing sysmon rules in order to detect these MITRE TTPs. This is something that you can easily implement within your organization, something that I'm pushing with my customers when I see things not being detected or identified correctly. These are free resources. You already probably have a SIM. It's just a matter of taking these rules that the community has built and implementing it with your environment. So it's a quick win for you to at least get the first pass when it comes to mitigating some of these tactics, which is let's start off by first putting in a compensating control to detection. We like to use the OODA loop, if you're familiar, from the Air Force, which is let's observe what's going on in the environment. Something like run DLL 32, which happens to be the one that failed most. How often is run DLL 32 being executed with your environment? If it's executed 1,000 times a day, then it might not be a good rule to monitor and alert on. But if it happens once a month, then you probably want to set up some rule sets around that. So it's just a matter of grasping where you stand, making a decision based on what you see, and then maybe taking it a step further to outright blocking that executable in an environment, which is what I've seen some customers do. Now, this is where I actually took every one of these MITRE techniques IDs, and I wanted to understand is how many attack groups are actually using some of these tactics. So if you see here, standard application layer protocol, basically communication through kind of the standard protocols, over 137 different attack groups, according to MITRE's research, are actually using that tactics. So that's why that's one of the more kind of highlighted ones here. And we get down to something like, registry keys in the startup folder. That's something where we saw about 60 different TTP groups, actually observing this. Now, this is a situation where I kind of did this in a general fashion. So basically, across all the actors, I just wanted to see where more activity was occurring. One of the things that we would do, and we're kind of working with a customer, is identify those actors that are specific to their industry, and then create a heat map based on that instead, versus being general as we've done here. That way, and John will talk about this and how he's done it, at his organization, you can focus on the tactics that matter most specific to your organization, to your industry, that are targeting you. So then, out of all those kind of tactics that I've described and talked through a little bit, I wanted to have you walk away with some recommendations. The MITRE technique IDs on the left, these are the top 5 from the perspective of more number of attack groups, actors, I should say, that's the terminology at MITRE, are actually using these tactics. So these are things that I suggest you go back to your organization and see what you have in place for these. Start, again, just with simple sysmon rules, you can actually cover these 5 as an example. So it's a good starting place to look at. When it comes to data sources, process monitoring, like I said, covered about 12 out of the 16 MITRE technique IDs that I found, and the rest of them, are also some of the ones that were found to also be, cover most of those techniques as well. So yeah, if you guys, when you go out there again, and when you're talking to vendors, and we have those conversations all the time through our customers, which is, this is what the attacker is going to do. My control in place is this, and this is my expectation. So when you go out there and you're talking to the vendors, I highly suggest you ask them about some of these techniques. Ask them how their technology goes about either mitigating, detecting, responding, or even setting up workflows. I'm starting to see that a lot when it comes to remediation and processes within your organization, and ask them about them. And then before I hand it off to John here, I kind of just took the kind of count and created one of these word graphs, so you can see which APT groups are out of those 12 scenarios that I chose, and the MITRE techniques associated with them. The ones that you see bigger here that kind of stand out and pop up to you are the ones that are most pervasive in using those 16 technique IDs that I found. So with that, I'll hand it off to John.
Cool. Thanks, Jose. On a total side note, APT 29, if you guys go by their booth, they actually have a gigantic Lego model with all of the TTPs laid out. So right now we're going to talk about how we use all of the data that they're providing along with the MITRE ATT&CK framework in order to systematically reduce the risk that these things actually play in our environment. So obviously everybody's talking about MITRE right now. It's kind of becoming the de facto language that security professionals are using. Not because it's perfect, but because it's common and is a systematic way to explain what it is that we're looking at. The other advantage of it is you can take adversaries' behaviors, similar to what Jose did with the mapping to different APT groups or advanced actor groups, and you can actually take all of their behaviors that they'll carry on throughout the life cycle of their attack and map it down to the behaviors that they're doing in a systematic way. So when you get all of this information, whether it's from an Intel report, from something like this that Jose's team has provided with the most common things that are missed, you're not ever going to create one single piece of content that's going to solve all of these problems. And if you think you are, you're actually setting yourself up for failure. So what I tend to look at it is you're creating a minefield. Adversaries, they're going to have new techniques, they're going to have new novel ways of bypassing things. Your only hope is that you have enough detection logic out there that they're going to trip something. And the biggest advantage that you have is that in general, your adversaries aren't going to actually know the content that you've deployed in order to catch them. So this is just a silly slide on what risk is, where assets, threats, and vulnerabilities meet, just a common thing. And so now once you have all this information, it comes down to prioritizing where you're actually going to spend your biggest resource, your biggest asset, which is the time of your people. Different companies will have different budgets, you'll have different tool sets, but the one thing that everybody has in common is that they have hours, man hours, that they can apply to solve these problems. And so depending on the level of effort, let me take that back a step. So the first thing you have to do then is figure out who's going to be the most likely organization that's going to target you. So if you're looking for some free resources, here's one online where you can actually go and they actually have tables laid out of what adversaries have done across different campaigns. And so using information like that or information that Jose's provided, or a group like Jose's, you take it and you map it out to where these techniques actually line up on the MITRE framework. And so here you can see that I've taken some of those techniques and I lined them up. And I'll explain the color coding in a second. It is like a stoplight method. And so one of the first things that we do is we take a look at all of our controls and we see where they map out. This is all notional data, but if you think you have effective controls for something, you label it green, somewhat effective, yellow, no controls, red. And so by doing this, it lays it out in a very plain way for you to see where your controls are actually failing. And then if you overlay it with, this is just zoomed in, with the attacker's most likely path to success, now you're able to see where you need to stop that particular actor and where your opportunity is. And so what I do is I'll actually take these techniques and I'll look and I'll see where I have the least amount of work that I have to do in order to actually close out entire tactics, not just techniques sporadically placed, but entire tactics. And so using this as an example, you can see that persistence, credential access, and discovery has the least amount of work needed to be done, level of effort or man hours applied to it in order to close this down. And by doing so, we actually have 3 lanes of green going east to west, where we have opportunities to catch and detect these adversaries. So one of the big things that we do is I believe in actually simulating the activity, getting real data in order to figure out what you expect your adversaries to do. Some people call it purple teaming, some people call it red teaming or continuous evaluation, whatever you want to call it. It comes down to getting sources of information of what a behavior actually looks like and then building out detection logic against that. It can come from paid vendors such as AttackIQ. It can come from Atomic Red Team, all those GitHub repos where people actually have examples of log files and system events of things that are created. And also Intel feeds and commercial tools. Ultimately, if you have the time and resources, go to your lab environment, actually execute these attacks and see what it looks like with a simulated stack similar to yours.